Good evening. Let's turn our Bibles to Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16. When we read Acts chapter 16, we might think and read through that the main characters are Paul and Silas. After all, we're following them on their journey. We're following Paul and Silas and what they do. And Acts 16 does mark the beginning of their second missionary journey. But what we're going to find as we read, we're going to discover that, well, there's a driving force behind everything that we read, and that driving force is God. The main idea that I want us to think about in this lesson is that when God is sovereign, what we see from Paul and Silas is really excellent examples of what faithfulness looks like. And so we should be faithful as well. What we should do is we should, as they preach the gospel and we preach the gospel, live our lives in step with the gospel, to be Christ-like. Paul and Silas are following God's direction, even if that direction isn't always so clear in the moment. And so when we go through Acts 16, we're going to see some patterns. We're going to see patterns such as, well, they have an idea, they have a plan, but then God says no to that plan. Or maybe they act out of habit because that's what they always do, and then God blesses them in that situation. Or maybe what we're going to see is them act out of an impulse, and then yet God connects things and makes connections that maybe they never would have thought of. Or maybe they have blessings that they didn't think about or they take for granted, and later becomes opportunities that they never saw. What's beautiful about the Christian life is that we don't just merely react to circumstances. We respond in faith to a God who rules over us. And so I want us to pay attention to Paul and Silas here and how they react to some of these situations. They can't go into a region they thought, that's okay. There's no synagogue in the town. What do we do? Maybe there's a person that's being annoying. Well, how do they react to that? Or they find themselves, we're going to read them, finding themselves in prison. Well, how does that affect them? And how do they continue to remain faithful? And so tonight, we're going to follow the flow of the text and look at the narrative and what it's telling us from that lens. Because there's a lot that we could pull out, but we don't want to get lost in the weeds. So we're going to dive in. We're going to start in verse 6. In verse 6. God is at work here. This is our theme. God is at work, and we are to be faithful. At this point, Paul and Silas have been encouraging the churches around the Galatian region. They've picked up Timothy along the way, and there's a plan to go further into Asia, but then God steps in. So verse 6. Verse 6. Well, if it will work. Verse 6. There we go. And they went through the region, Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. All right. You read verse 7 here, and what do we see? You read verse 7, and they have some plans. We're going to go deeper into Asia. We're going to go into Bithynia here. That's up near the Black Sea. And as we go there, and as they go over there, the Spirit of the Lord stops them. The Spirit of Jesus, we're told, stops them. And so what do? Well, then they go to Troas. They go to Troas, and this is a moment where they head in a different direction, and maybe we find ourselves in this moment as well in life, where sometimes, like Paul and Silas here, we're wandering around, and we're kind of aimless here. We don't have much direction. We're not sure where to go. We thought we were going to go to a certain place, but then God says, no. When all doors seem closed, what we do is we wait for God to open a door. And you know what? It may be a door that we least expect. What's going to happen is, well, God's going to tell them, no, you're actually going to go into Europe. You're going to go into the nation over here that's Greek, the Macedonian nation, to a little town there in the top corner of Philippi. Let's look at our text. Verse 9. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. What does this man say in verse 9? I find that so remarkable. He says, in this vision, he says, come over and help us. We need to stop and consider, for example, how much the gospel actually helps people. Because how are they to help them? By preaching the gospel. That's the idea there in verse 10. We need to consider just how much the gospel affects other people. It isn't just about giving them helpful information. Like, here's some information and here's some news. No, this is something that is actually going to help you and change your life. The gospel is life-changing news. And when people then live in step with the gospel and create relationships and continue to build upon those relationships, it changes lives. We can't glance over that and think that we're just going to go and deliver information and therefore help people. That's not the case. When we're looking at Paul and Silas here, they're going where they are called, and they're going where God needs them, and God needs them at this place, and they are prepared to help with the gospel. That's why God is at work, and we are to remain faithful, living our lives in step with the gospel. And so that is the call there. And what happens is this leads to some conversions in situations that we might not expect, that are just not normal situations that they find themselves in. And so let's look at that. Acts chapter 16, verse 11. This is what happens. So, setting sail for Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day, the Neapolis, and from there they landed in Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days. And on Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. At this point, we should understand Paul's character here, and really the character of the apostles. It's Sabbath. Where do they usually go? They're usually going to the synagogue, where historically they go and they tell the Jews and they tell the God-fearers about Jesus. This is their opportunity to do that. But they land here in Philippi, and it doesn't seem like they're doing that. Instead, they go, it says, outside the city to a river, to a place that they suppose is a place of prayer. They're going to where spiritual things seem to be happening. Now, the text doesn't explicitly say this, but it seems to imply that there is no synagogue in the area. And the reason for that might be because this is a Roman colony. Here in Philippi, this is predominantly a Roman city full of Roman citizens, soldiers and veterans. It's a mini Rome, if you will. And the problem is, there's probably not a synagogue because there's probably not enough of a Jewish populace. But it's still Sabbath. It's still Sabbath. And what is their habit? Their habit is to go and pray. To go and connect with their fellow Jews and to connect with God and to preach the gospel there. And yet they find themselves in a situation that's just not normal. If it's not available, what do? They go to this river to pray. You see, they continue to remain faithful. I think in our life, in our situation, sometimes when things don't go the way that we expect, we find ourselves in a situation that Is it normal? It's easy to throw up our hands and to give up and think, well, I guess I can't preach the gospel to them, or I don't know what to do, and therefore I'm just not going to do anything. But when we're looking at this chapter and we realize that God is the main character, and He's the one that's actually orchestrating this situation in a beautiful moment, because Paul and Silas continue to act faithfully. Look at verse 14. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, so perhaps she's wealthy, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said to Paul. And after she was baptized and her household was well, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. You read that text, what jumps out at you when you read that text? For me, I'm reading that, and who opened Lydia's heart? God did. So often we put pressure on ourselves to open the hearts of others. And we think, well, maybe if I just say something in this way, or I present the gospel in this way, their hearts will be open to what I have to say, to the gospel. This is actually a wonderful lesson that shows us, no, we need to remain faithful, live in accordance with the gospel, because God is the one that opens up hearts to hearing the gospel. And this continues with our theme. And when we're not sure to go, God opens up these opportunities for us. There's no synagogue, and yet they continue to act faithfully. They're talking, they're praying to people, and God opens a heart. Now, we can't go into the mechanics of why Lydia, why not the other women, why doesn't, if God's all-powerful, open up the hearts of all the women there? There's a little detail in the text, though, I don't want us to miss that might help us understand that a little bit in verse 14. When the text is describing Lydia, how is she described? She's a woman who already worships God. Right? It says there that she is a worshiper of God. That at least makes a difference. It tells us something. It tells us that she's already worshiping God. She's open to God. She's open to the things of God. She's going to be open to Jesus. She's going to be open to what God has to say and hearing the gospel. And he's doing it day after day, and it's becoming quite the annoyance. Paul is annoyed, we're told. He's annoyed by this evil spirit, and he commands that this spirit come out of her. Even though that this woman here and what this spirit is saying is correct, is truthful. These are servants of the Most High God proclaiming the way of salvation. That's right. But we have to remember, this is God's message. This is the good news. These are God's servants. It's their job to deliver that message. We don't want the gospel coming out of mouths of evil spirits. I think of so many times when Jesus is really casting out demons, he's reminding them to be silent. It's one act like this that leads to a conversion. Now, I can imagine that in this moment, when Paul does this, it wouldn't be easy to see how the ramifications of this and where this is going. I don't imagine Paul is thinking that this is eventually going to lead to my arrest. Now, we don't know what happens to this woman, but the men who owned her are not happy with what Paul has done. Look at verses 19 through 21. 19 through 21. But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. They are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." The thing I want you to pay attention to is verse 19. Look at these owners. What is their hope that the Spirit is giving them? A hope of gain. A hope of giving them financial gain, wealth. Look at verse 22. The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore their garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer, and this is where he comes onto the scene, to keep them safely. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison, fastened their feet in the stocks. Don't read over those verses without realizing just how much pain Paul and Silas went through. It starts with the mob attacking them, it says. It says there that the crowd joined in attacking them, beating them, you could say. It starts with maybe fists and kicks, and then it moves to the authorities beating them with rods, and then the jailer comes onto the scene and puts them in the inner prison. Or the inner prison. This is the darkest part of the prison. There are no windows, no natural light. It's far from any entrance. This is historically where they would have kept the most dangerous, problematic prisoners. We're talking about maximum confinement, harsh conditions. Why? Was Paul and Silas, were they being violent? No. What'd they do? Paul removed an evil spirit, and therefore someone's hope of financial gain was gone. There's no indication that Paul knew that all this was going to happen because of one annoyed reaction. But whatever the intentions, even though we don't often know the consequences of our actions, we have to rely on Christ and His authority. We can't always expect to know what comes next. We can't control what always comes next, but what we can do is control how we react. And that's exactly what Paul and Silas do. Beaten, bloodied, and chained, what do they do in this situation that they find themselves? Verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to him, singing and praying. It's natural for us to to read that text and to zoom out and to maybe think of a few passages that come to mind. To think of maybe Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. This is Paul writing to the Christians in this very town, the letter of Philippians. And he says what? Rejoice in the Lord always. Rejoice during the bad times, the good times, always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Of course, this is a little speculation. I read this, I like to think of maybe later on, this is written maybe a decade or more so later, the jailer and Lydia possibly hearing these words and thinking about what they witnessed from Paul and Silas' example in Acts 16. But other passages that come to mind, and maybe James chapter 1, verse 2, count it all joy, God says, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Think back about that person who owned that slave girl and the hope that they had, the hope of gain, the hope of profit and wealth. That hope was coming from that spirit. What kind of hope do you think Paul and Silas have sitting here in the inner prison? Well, they have only a hope that the Spirit of Jesus can give them. And yet we're told, no matter where they are, they have a hope that is within them. We're told in the scriptures that we need to have a defense for the hope that is within us. That can happen by conversation, but it can also happen by example. And that's the example that we see from Paul and Silas. They are setting that example and showing the hope that they have because of Christ. And so they're praying and they're singing hymns in darkness. How are they able to have that type of joy? Because I look at this example and it is something that we should all strive to have. I'm talking about the deepest, darkest parts of our life, having that desire, that need, and that impulse to want to connect with God and sing and pray. Jesus should come to our mind when in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it tells us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus wasn't just going through trials. He was carrying the cross. He was carrying the weight of the world's sin on his shoulders, and he endured the cross for the joy that was set before him. That's true for Paul and Silas and the joy that they had, and it's true for you and the joy that you have as well. He's the one, because of what he did, allows you to have that joy. The gospel provides for us a level of joy that is only possible through Jesus. Remember what the man, when Paul had that vision, what that man from Macedonia was saying? He was urging them to come and help. Again, it is easy to think that the gospel doesn't really do anything for anybody. You know what? It actually provides deeper joy than anyone can achieve in some of the life's darkest moments. The gospel may not be some miracle medication or some, a cure that it cures cancer. It's better than that. Unlike all of those things, the gospel actually saves you. And in a world where death is 100% certain, 100% guaranteed, the gospel is what everyone needs most. And the jailer sees that. I can imagine that this jailer, looking at this and listening to this, is very familiar with how prisoners normally act, and yet he's seeing these prisoners pray and sing. Look at verse 26. Verse 26. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. This would be scary for the jailer. A very scary event. I mean, you're in charge of watching some serious criminals here, and now all of a sudden you see the doors are open. Verse 26, it says, everyone's bonds were unfastened. That's scary for the jailer. If they've all escaped, then the responsibility is on him, and the authorities are coming for him, and they will probably put him to death. And so the jailer is willing to take his own life, supposing that the prisoners have escaped, the text says. You read that and you can feel the relief when Paul shouts out and says, no, don't harm yourself. I want us to realize that, yes, Paul and Silas aren't, they're not necessarily preaching the gospel here, but they are living their lives faithfully in step with the gospel. And this is all we can do in times and situations of uncertainty. The gospel is a message of life. And God is the main character. And Paul makes sure that no, you know what? To the jailer, you can live. You actually have something worth living for. And when we can actually live what we preach, it makes what we're preaching so much easier, so much more powerful, really. Look at verses 30 through 31. Acts chapter 16, verses 30 through 31. And then he brought them out and notice what he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Paul has already saved his physical life. He said, no, stop, don't harm yourself. So what is the jailer actually asking here? He's seeing something deeper and says, how can I be made right with God? And they say, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. For the jailer, he has seen now, he has witnessed the power of God. These men in his mind are no longer these dangerous criminals that he's been told to lock up. No, they are messengers. They are servants of the Most High proclaiming what? The way of salvation, we're told earlier in the text. Belief isn't just an acknowledgement of facts. It is complete and 100% commitment to God, and that's what leads the jailer in the following verses to hear the word of the Lord, and in that belief, be baptized at once, it says. Notice the urgency, verses 32 through 33. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house, and they took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds. And he was baptized at once, he and all his family. And at that point, you have the church in Philippi. And it's just a few families. It's small. But the way it all came about is completely wild and unexpected when you let the narrative tell you the story. But who's the main character during all of it? It's God. God's the main character. All of it is possible because God's hand was at work the whole time, and Paul and Silas were just great examples for us of what it means to live by faith and to live in step with the gospel. I'm going to pursue God and his righteousness, knowing that, God may open up doors that seem shut. Open up hearts that seem closed. Open up jail cells in dark, hopeless places. Or build connections I never thought possible, or provide unexpected opportunities, as we're going to see here at the end of the text. Let's finish the chapter, Acts chapter 16. Look at verses 35 through 37. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and do they now throw us out secretly? No, Let them come themselves and take us out. Verse 38. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. And they went out of the prison, visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. God was in control all the way to the end, and the same is true for your life. We may not have miraculous powers or be able to, see visions like Paul here, but God's hand is still at work. The gospel actually helps people. And all of us need to be like the Christians in this passage who remain faithful in living in step with the gospel. If you're not a Christian, though, and you don't know where life is taking you, you don't have much direction, you're wandering around aimlessly, you're sick of maybe fighting against life, that can stop. You can actually have a reason to live, as we saw from the jailer. What you need to do is be like Lydia and the jailer, believe and be baptized and wash away your sins. If that's what you want to do it now, urgently, while we stand and we sing.